I was 29 years old, working someone else's land for a share of the harvest, when my plow blades struck something that would change everything. But to understand why that moment mattered so much, I need to take you back to how I ended up sharecropping in rural Alabama in the first place. My name is Thomas Bennett, and I grew up in Birmingham with dreams that had nothing to do with farming. I'd gone to college, studied business administration, and landed what seemed like a promising job at a marketing firm downtown. For 3 years, I wore suits, sat in meetings, and created campaigns for products I didn't care about. The work paid well enough, but something felt hollow about it all. I'd wake up each morning with a sense of dread, counting down the hours until I could leave the office, and wondering if this was really all there was to life. My father had been a factory worker, and my mother cleaned houses to help make ends meet. They'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had, and here I was, living their dream for me, feeling more lost than ever. I didn't talk about these feelings with anyone because it seemed ungrateful. How could I complain when I had stability, benefits, and a career path that so many people would have been grateful for? Everything changed when my father had a massive heart attack at 56. He survived, but the medical bills were crushing and he couldn't work anymore. My parents had always lived paycheck to paycheck, and suddenly they were facing financial ruin. I helped as much as I could with my salary, but it wasn't enough to cover both their expenses and my own apartment in the city. The stress was overwhelming, and I felt helpless watching my parents struggle after they'd given me so much. Around that same time, my company went through restructuring. My department was eliminated, and I found myself unemployed with a severance package that would last maybe 3 months if I was careful. I was 27, broke, worried about my parents, and questioning every choice I'd made since graduating. That's when I got a call from my Uncle Raymond, my father's older brother, who I hadn't seen in probably 5 years. Raymond lived in a small town called Meadowbrook, about 2 hours south of Birmingham. He'd inherited a 40-acre farm from his father-in-law years ago, but at 68, he was finding it increasingly difficult to manage alone. His wife had passed away the previous year, and his children had moved to different states for their careers. He'd been considering selling the property, but then he thought of me. "I heard about your situation," he said during that phone call, his voice gravelly from years of outdoor work. "I know it's not glamorous, but I've got land that needs working. I can't pay you a regular wage, but we could work out a sharecropping arrangement. You'd get a portion of whatever we produce. Plus, there's a small house on the property you could live in rent-free. Your parents could move in too if they needed. It's not much, but it's something." My initial reaction was to decline politely. I was a college graduate with a business degree. Sharecropping seemed like something from a history book, not a real option for someone like me in the 21st century. But as I sat in my apartment that night, looking at my dwindling bank account and thinking about my parents' situation, I realized I didn't have the luxury of being picky. And something about Uncle Raymond's offer sparked a curiosity I couldn't quite explain. I visited the farm the following weekend. The property was beautiful in a rundown sort of way. Fields that had once been productive were now overgrown with weeds. The equipment was old but functional. The farmhouse where Uncle Raymond lived was a modest 2-story structure that had seen better days, and the smaller house he'd mentioned was about a 1/4 mile down a dirt road. It was a tiny 2-bedroom place that hadn't been occupied in years, but it had good bones and would be fine once cleaned up. "It's cotton and soybeans mostly," Uncle Raymond explained as we walked the property. "Used to do some corn too, but that's harder on my back these days. The land is good, just needs someone with the energy to work it properly. I'll teach you everything you need to know. We split the profits 60-40, with you getting the 40%. Once you learn the operation, we can renegotiate." I didn't know anything about farming. I'd never driven a tractor, never planted a seed with any intention beyond a houseplant, never spent a full day working under the sun. But standing there looking at those fields, I felt something I hadn't felt in my office job: possibility. Not certainty, not comfort, but the sense that maybe I could build something real here. 2 weeks later, I'd packed up my Birmingham apartment, moved my parents into the small farmhouse with me, and started learning how to be a farmer. My mother cried when we arrived, though I couldn't tell if it was from gratitude or concern that her son with a college degree was now a sharecropper. My father, still recovering from his heart attack, seemed relieved to have a place where he could rest without worrying about rent. The first 6 months were brutal. Uncle Raymond was patient but demanding. He'd grown up farming and expected a level of physical endurance I didn't have. I woke before dawn, worked until my hands bled, and fell into bed each night, too exhausted to question my decision. My body, soft from years of office work, slowly adapted to the constant physical demands. I learned to read the sky for weather changes, to recognize healthy plants from diseased ones, to operate machinery that seemed held together by willpower and duct tape. By the time spring arrived in my second year on the farm, I'd transformed into someone I barely recognized. My hands were calloused, my skin darkened from constant sun exposure, and I could work a full day without feeling like I might collapse. More importantly, I'd begun to understand the rhythm of farming, the patience it required, and the deep satisfaction that came from nurturing something from seed to harvest. Uncle Raymond had kept his word about teaching me, sharing knowledge accumulated over decades about soil conditions, crop rotation, and the thousand small details that separated successful farming from failure. The previous year's harvest had been modest, but profitable enough to prove the arrangement could work. My 40% share wasn't making me rich, but combined with my parents' social security and the fact that we had no rent, we were managing. My father's health had actually improved with the slower pace of rural life and fresh air. My mother had started a small vegetable garden and was happier than I'd seen her in years. Against all expectations, we were building a life here. That March morning started like any other. Uncle Raymond had asked me to plow the south field, a 12-acre section we'd left fallow the previous year to let the soil recover. It was good land, rich and dark, and we were planning to plant soybeans once I'd prepared it properly. The weather was perfect for field work, cool enough that you didn't overheat, but warm enough that the ground had thawed and dried from the winter rains. I'd been working for about 3 hours, making steady progress with the old John Deere tractor, when I felt the plow blade catch on something solid. This happened occasionally when you hit a large rock or old root, so I reversed, adjusted my lines slightly and tried again. The blade caught again, harder this time, and I heard a scraping sound that meant metal on metal. That was unusual. I shut off the tractor and climbed down to investigate. At first, I couldn't see anything but churned earth. I grabbed a shovel from the tractor's toolbox and started carefully digging around where the plow had caught. About 8 inches down, I uncovered the edge of something flat and metallic. My first thought was that I'd hit an old piece of farm equipment someone had buried decades ago, which would be annoying to remove, but not particularly interesting. I kept digging, widening the area, and realized this wasn't a random piece of metal. It was a box, roughly 2 feet long and a foot wide, made from what looked like copper or bronze that had aged to a deep green patina. The box was heavier than I expected when I finally worked it free from the soil, and it was sealed tight with some kind of fitted lid that had corroded into place over time. My heart was pounding as I carried it back to the tractor. This was clearly something old, something that had been deliberately buried. I thought about opening it right there in the field, but something made me want to show Uncle Raymond first. This was his land, his family's land going back generations, and whatever this box contained might be connected to that history. I loaded the box into the tractor's cargo area and drove back to the main house faster than I probably should have. Uncle Raymond was on his porch, drinking coffee and reviewing seed catalogs when I pulled up. The look on my face must have told him something significant had happened. "Found something in the south field," I said, carefully lifting the box and carrying it up to the porch. The plow hit it about 8 inches down. Uncle Raymond set down his coffee and stared at the box with an expression I couldn't quite read. He reached out and touched it gently, running his fingers over the corroded surface. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "I never thought we'd find it." "Find what?" I asked. "You know what this is?" He nodded slowly, his eyes getting distant like he was looking at something far away in memory. "My grandfather, my mother's father, who owned this land originally, he used to tell a story. This was back in the 1920s, during some of the hardest times this area ever saw. He said there was a preacher who came through these parts, a traveling minister who held revivals in small towns and farming communities. The preacher stayed here on this property for 3 days, and before he left, he told my grandfather that he was burying something in the south field. Said it was a sign from heaven that would be found when the time was right, when someone who truly needed it was working the land. I looked at the box with new eyes, feeling a chill run down my spine despite the warm spring air. "Your grandfather never dug it up." "He tried," Uncle Raymond said. "Spent weeks searching that field, but never found anything. Eventually decided maybe the preacher had been touched in the head, or that the whole story was some kind of parable. After a while, everyone forgot about it. I heard the story as a child, but I always thought it was just family legend, you know, something to tell kids to make the farm seem more interesting." We both stared at the box, neither of us quite ready to open it yet. The weight of almost 100 years pressed down on that moment. Whatever was inside had been waiting in the dark earth all this time, through generations of farming, through seasons of plenty and drought, through wars and depressions, and all the turning of the world above it. "Well," Uncle Raymond finally said, "I suppose we should see what heaven left for us." Before we continue with what happened next, I want to take a moment to say something. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more real-life accounts about unexpected discoveries and the mysterious ways things work out when we least expect them, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. And I'm curious, have you ever found something unexpected that changed your perspective on your own situation? Maybe you discovered an old family letter or stumbled across something that gave you a new direction when you needed it most. Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences might inspire someone else who's watching. Uncle Raymond went inside and returned with a flathead screwdriver and a hammer. We worked carefully, not wanting to damage whatever might be inside, tapping gently around the edges of the lid to break the corrosion seal. After about 15 minutes of patient work, the lid finally gave way with a sound like a deep breath being released. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but was now brittle and disintegrating, were several items. The first thing I pulled out was a leather journal, remarkably well preserved thanks to the airtight seal of the box. The cover was embossed with a cross, and the initials JMW Uncle Raymond handled it like it was made of glass, carefully opening to the first page where neat handwriting declared, "The Journal of Reverend James Michael Walsh, 1923. Beneath the journal were 3 other items that made us both fall silent. The first was a bundle of old currency, bills from the 1920s wrapped in twine. Uncle Raymond's hands shook slightly as he counted them. Nearly $300 in various denominations, which would have been a substantial sum in that era. The second item was a gold pocket watch with an inscription on the back, "To JMW, for faithful service, First Baptist Church, Montgomery." The third was a sealed envelope with "To whoever finds this," written across the front in the same careful handwriting as the journal. Uncle Raymond opened the envelope first, removing a letter written on church stationery that had yellowed with age but remained legible. He read it aloud, his voice catching several times. "To the person who has discovered this box, I pray this letter finds you in a time of need, for that is God's way. I am Reverend James Walsh, and I am dying. The doctors in Montgomery have given me perhaps 3 months to live. Tuberculosis has taken my strength, and soon will take my life. I have no family to leave my small possessions to, and I do not want them to simply disappear into the hands of strangers who might not understand their significance. I have traveled throughout Alabama for 12 years, bringing the word to small communities and farming families who rarely see a proper minister. The work has been hard but rewarding, and I have met some of the finest people God ever created. During my travels, I stayed 3 days with the Carlyle family on their farm outside Meadowbrook. Robert Carlyle and his wife Martha treated me with such kindness and hospitality, though I could see they had little to spare. We talked long into the nights about faith, about hardship, about the struggle to maintain hope when the land is harsh and the times are difficult. Before I left, God spoke to my heart with a message. I was to bury these items, my life's small treasures, in their south field, not for them to find necessarily, but for whoever would be working that land when the time was right. I cannot explain how I knew this, only that the conviction was absolute. I told Robert what I was doing, and he thought perhaps the illness had affected my mind, but he allowed me to do it anyway. Inside this box, you will find my journal, which contains 12 years of observations about faith, doubt, suffering, and grace. You will find the money I had saved for my retirement, which I will no longer need. You will find my father's pocket watch, my most precious possession, given to him for 40 years of service to his congregation. These items have no value to me now, but perhaps they will have value to you. If you have found this, I believe you are meant to have it. Not because you are luckier than others, but because you are doing the hard work of tending land, of nurturing growth, of participating in God's creation in the most direct way possible. Farming is holy work, though the world often fails to recognize it as such. Those who labor in the soil are partners with the divine in the ongoing act of creation. Use these items wisely. The money, if it still has value when you find this, should be used to sustain your work. The watch is worth something and can be sold if needed. The journal is my true legacy, my honest account of a life spent trying to serve. Perhaps my struggles and small victories will encourage you in yours. I will be gone from this world by the time you read this, but know that I prayed for you before I buried this box. I prayed that whoever found it would be someone who needed encouragement, who needed to know that their work matters, and who needed a tangible sign that they are exactly where they are meant to be. May God bless your labor and your life. Reverend James Michael Walsh, June 1923. The silence after Uncle Raymond finished reading was profound. We both sat there on the porch, 2 grown men with tears in our eyes, holding objects that had been waiting in the dark for 102 years. The spring breeze moved through the trees, and I could hear birds singing, and everything felt charged with significance. Your grandfather, I finally said, Robert Carlyle. He was a good man. Uncle Raymond nodded. One of the best from what I heard. He kept this farm going through the Depression, raised 5 children on this land, and never turned away anyone who needed help. He died before I was born, but everyone who knew him spoke of him with respect. My mother used to say he had an unshakable faith, even when times were hardest. I picked up the journal carefully and opened it to a random page. The entry was dated August 1919, and it described Reverend Walsh's visit to a farming family who had just lost their youngest child to influenza. His words were raw and honest about the difficulty of offering comfort when he himself was wrestling with questions about why God allowed such suffering. But he wrote about sitting with that family, sharing their grief, and how in the midst of that darkness they found moments of grace in simply being together. He was real, I said, not pretending to have all the answers, just trying to help people get through hard times. Uncle Raymond was examining the pocket watch, which still ticked when he wound it. My grandfather must have thought about this his whole life, wondering what the preacher buried, wondering if the story was true. And here it was, all along, just waiting. I thought about my own journey to this farm, how lost I'd been just 2 years earlier, how uncertain about everything. I thought about my parents sleeping peacefully in the little farmhouse, finally secure after years of struggle. I thought about the satisfaction I'd found in work I never expected to do, in a life I never planned to live. Over the following weeks, Uncle Raymond and I spent our evenings reading through Reverend Walsh's journal. It became a kind of ritual. After the day's work was done and dinner was finished, we'd sit on the porch with the weathered pages and read entries aloud. The journal was a window into a world that had vanished, but the human struggles it described felt startlingly contemporary. Walsh wrote about farmers who couldn't pay their debts, about families torn apart by disagreement, about people who lost faith when tragedy struck, and about those who somehow maintained hope against overwhelming odds. He wrote about his own doubts, his loneliness on the road, his fear that his ministry wasn't making any real difference. But he also wrote about moments of connection, small kindnesses that restored his spirit, and the quiet faith of people who kept working and believing even when they had every reason to give up. One entry particularly struck me. It was from May 1922, and Walsh described visiting a sharecropper family who were on the verge of losing everything. The father was sick, the crops had failed, and they had 3 young children to feed. Walsh wrote, "I had only $5 in my pocket, and I gave it to them, knowing it would barely help. But the wife took my hands and said, 'Reverend, you showing up today was the sign we needed that we haven't been forgotten.' I realized then that sometimes presence matters more than provision. Sometimes just showing up is the miracle." That passage made me think about Uncle Raymond's offer, how he'd reached out when I was drowning, how his timing had been exactly right, even though he couldn't have known how desperate I was. And it made me think about the preacher's letter, about being exactly where you're meant to be. I'd spent so much of my life trying to follow a path that made sense to other people, trying to live up to expectations that didn't fit who I actually was. Maybe getting lost was necessary to find the right road. We decided to have the old currency and pocket watch appraised. A dealer in Birmingham specializing in historical items examined everything carefully. The bills, he explained, were no longer legal tender but had significant value to collectors. The pocket watch was 14-karat gold and in remarkable condition. Altogether, the items were worth approximately $17,000. Uncle Raymond insisted that the money was mine. "You found it," he said. "And more than that, the preacher's letter was clear. It was meant for whoever was working the land when the time was right. That's you, Thomas. You're the one who needed the sign." But I couldn't accept that reasoning entirely. It was your family's land. Your grandfather hosted the preacher. Without this farm and without you offering me this opportunity, I never would have been here to find anything. We compromised. We'd use the money to invest in the farm operation, purchasing equipment and making improvements that would benefit both of us. We bought a newer tractor to replace the ancient John Deere that was always breaking down. We installed a proper irrigation system for the south field. We repaired the roof on the main barn and upgraded the storage facilities. The investments immediately improved our efficiency and would increase our yields for years to come. But I kept the journal. Uncle Raymond agreed it should stay with me, that somehow it felt right for me to be its custodian. I read it completely, cover to cover, and then I read it again. Walsh's honest account of his struggles and faith became a kind of compass for me. When farming felt overwhelming, when I questioned whether I'd made the right choice leaving my old life behind, I'd read an entry and find perspective. My parents were amazed by the whole story. My mother, who'd been quietly worried about our financial stability despite her happiness with country life, relaxed considerably once the farm improvements were made. My father, still recovering but stronger every month, started helping with lighter tasks around the property. He'd never been a religious man, but the story of the buried box affected him deeply. "Makes you think there's a plan," he said one evening as we sat together on the porch. "All those years I worked in that factory, hating every minute, thinking I was doing it for you. Then I have a heart attack that nearly kills me, you lose your job, and we end up here where you're actually happy. And then you literally dig up a sign telling you you're in the right place. If that's not a message, I don't know what is." Word of the discovery spread through Meadowbrook despite our efforts to keep it quiet. Small towns don't keep secrets well, and soon people were stopping by to hear the story and see the journal. I was surprised by how many people were touched by it. Several older farmers came to tell me their own stories about Reverend Walsh. whose circuit had included their grandparents' farms. One woman brought a photograph from 1921 showing Walsh at a church picnic, a thin man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The local historical society asked if they could make copies of certain journal pages for their archives, and a professor from the University of Alabama drove down to interview us about the find. She explained that Walsh's journal was valuable as a primary source about rural Alabama life in the 1920s, a perspective rarely documented in such personal detail. Most historical records focus on prominent people or major events, she said. But journals like this show us how ordinary people actually lived, what they worried about, what gave them hope. This is a real treasure, but the journal's value to me was more personal than historical. It was a reminder that the work I was doing mattered, that it was part of a long tradition of people who'd labored on this land, struggled with uncertainty, and somehow found meaning in the effort. Walsh's words about farming being holy work resonated deeply. There was something sacred about planting seeds and trusting them to grow, about working with natural cycles instead of against them, about producing food that would nourish others. By summer, our crops were thriving. The soybeans in the south field, the same field where I'd found the box, were the healthiest plants on the entire farm. Uncle Raymond joked that the ground had been blessed by what it held all those years. Whether that was literally true or not, something had certainly changed for me. I was no longer just getting by or making do. I was building something. The harvest that fall was the best the farm had seen in a decade. The combination of improved equipment, better irrigation, favorable weather, and what Uncle Raymond kept calling blessed ground resulted in yields that exceeded our most optimistic projections. My share of the profits was more than I'd earned in my best year at the marketing firm, and the work felt infinitely more satisfying. Uncle Raymond and I renegotiated our arrangement as he'd promised. He moved the split to 50-50, making us equal partners in the operation. He also began talking seriously about retirement and what would happen to the farm long term. His children had no interest in returning to run it, and he'd come to see me as the natural successor to the legacy his father-in-law had started. "I'm 69 now," he told me one October evening as we watched the sun set over the harvested fields. "I've got maybe 5 or 10 good years left if I'm lucky. This place needs someone who'll take care of it after I'm gone, someone who understands it's not just about profit, but about stewardship. I've been thinking about how to make that happen." The conversation moved slowly over the following months, but eventually Uncle Raymond proposed that I could purchase the farm through a long-term arrangement that would let him stay in the main house as long as he lived. The price he quoted was well below market value, structured so that the farm's own revenue could cover the payments. It was extraordinarily generous, another example of the pattern that had defined my time here. People showing up exactly when needed, with exactly what was required. I was 31 when we signed the papers, making me the farm's owner, with Uncle Raymond retaining life estate in the main house and remaining involved in operations as long as he was able. It felt surreal to own land, to be responsible for 40 acres that stretched back through generations of family history. But it also felt right in a way I couldn't fully articulate. My parents were settled and happy. My father's health had stabilized, and he'd taken over managing the vegetable garden that had expanded significantly under my mother's enthusiastic cultivation. They were selling produce at the local farmers' market on weekends, enjoying the social interaction and the extra income. They'd both lost the stressed, worn-down look they'd carried for years. Country life had given them something city living never had, peace. I also met someone. Her name was Rachel, and she was a veterinarian who'd moved to Meadowbrook to take over the practice from the retiring local vet. She came to the farm initially to check on some cattle, and we discovered a mutual appreciation for the rhythms of rural life. She'd grown up in suburban Atlanta, gone to vet school with plans to open a small animal practice in a city, but found herself drawn to large animal medicine and the farming communities it served. "I think I was looking for something more meaningful," she told me on one of our early dates. Same as you were. Sometimes you have to take a detour from the plan to find what you're actually supposed to be doing. We were married 2 years later, in a small ceremony held right there on the farm, in the south field where I'd found the box. It seemed fitting to start our life together in the place where my own new life had truly begun. Uncle Raymond officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. He read a passage from Reverend Walsh's journal during the ceremony, words about faith and commitment and the importance of building something that lasts. Rachel and I had our first child 3 years into our marriage, a daughter we named Grace. When she was old enough to understand, I told her the story of the buried box and the traveling preacher, and the sign from heaven that her father had found when he needed it most. She loved hearing about Reverend Walsh and would ask me to read entries from his journal at bedtime. Uncle Raymond lived to 78, healthy and active, until the final 6 months when age finally caught up with him. He died peacefully in the main house, surrounded by family. Having seen the farm he'd preserved pass into hands he trusted. His funeral was held in the same field where Rachel and I had married, and it felt like closing a circle that had started with his grandfather hosting a dying preacher a century earlier. After Uncle Raymond passed, Rachel and I moved into the main house, and my parents took over the smaller farmhouse completely. The farm continued to thrive, and we expanded operations slightly, adding a small herd of cattle to complement the crop production. I taught Grace to drive the tractor when she was 10, just as Uncle Raymond had taught me. She took to farm life naturally, showing the same love for the land that I'd discovered in myself. The box and its contents remained displayed in the main house, in a glass case in the living room where everyone could see them. The journal stayed with me, though I'd had it professionally preserved to prevent further deterioration. I still read it regularly, finding new meaning in Walsh's words as my own life evolved. Sometimes, when I'm working in the south field, I think about that March morning when the plow blade struck metal. I think about all the unlikely events that had to align for that moment to happen. My job loss, my father's heart attack, Uncle Raymond's offer, my decision to accept, the specific day I chose to plow that specific section of that specific field. The statistical improbability of it all suggests either remarkable coincidence or something more intentional at work. I lean toward believing it was intentional, not because I can prove it, but because that interpretation gives meaning to the struggle. All the years of feeling lost, all the hardship that brought my family to the edge of disaster, all of it becomes part of a larger story about finding purpose through difficulty. Reverend Walsh wrote that his life's small treasures were meant for someone who needed to know their work mattered, and that they were exactly where they belonged. I was that person, and his century-old message reached me at precisely the right moment. The farm is now in its 5th generation of cultivation, and I'm its custodian for whatever time I have. Grace talks about studying agricultural science in college and returning to run the operation, which fills me with pride and hope. The land that I found by accident or by providence, depending on your perspective, has become my life's work and my family's foundation. When people ask me about the box and whether I really believe it was a sign from heaven, I tell them this: whether you attribute it to divine intervention, cosmic timing, or extraordinary luck doesn't matter as much as what you do with it. I found something buried in a field that told me I was on the right path. That gift came with responsibility, the obligation to honor it by doing good work, by taking care of the land, by building something meaningful that extends beyond my own lifetime. That's what I'm trying to do every day. Not because a preacher from 1923 commanded it, but because his example of faith, service, and honest struggle showed me what a well-lived life looks like. He couldn't have known who would find his message or when, but he trusted it would matter to someone. That trust, sustained across a century of darkness and silence, is perhaps the most profound lesson of all. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that sometimes the hardest moments in life are actually redirections towards something better, even when you can't see it at the time. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss future stories about unexpected turns, faith, and the mysterious ways things work out when we need them most. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment that felt like a sign you were on the right path? Maybe it was something small, a conversation at just the right time, or something more dramatic like finding something unexpected. Share your story with our community. We're all walking similar paths, just in different landscapes, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. What did this story teach you about trusting the journey, even when you can't see where it's leading? I'll be reading your comments, and I can't wait to hear your perspectives. Until next time, take care, and remember that sometimes the treasures we're looking for are buried in places we never thought to dig.